The winter of 1878 carved its fury deep into the bones of Sable Junction, where the railroad spur met endless sage prairie and the Willow Fork River ran black between shelves of treacherous ice. Snow fell in relentless curtains that December morning, muffling the sound of iron-shod hooves as Wakiza guided his paint gelding down the rutted main street. He was a man of 26 winters, broad-shouldered beneath his weathered buckskin coat, with the watchful stillness of someone who had learned survival from his grandmother's stories and his grandfather's lessons. Beneath his wide-brimmed hat, black braids hung to his shoulders, and his face held the composed alertness of a hunter who understood that death could emerge from any shadow without warning. The town's inhabitants barely glanced his way. As he passed, Indians were common enough in Sable Junction, mostly peaceful traders heading to the territorial capital. But Wakiza's presence carried purpose beyond commerce. He'd ridden 3 punishing days through blizzard conditions to reach this place driven by a debt of honor that burned steady in his chest like an ember from his people's sacred fire. Last autumn, he'd traded prime beaver pelts to old Garrett's Mercantile for winter supplies, ammunition, coffee, and the iron tools his band needed to survive another harsh season. The transaction had been clean, witnessed by both men, recorded in Garrett's meticulous hand. But death, as his grandmother often warned, had a way of tangling the simplest agreements into knots that could strangle a man's reputation. He dismounted at the hitching rail outside the store, his moccasined feet silent on packed snow. Through frost-clouded windows, he glimpsed shelves lined with civilization's manufactured promises, canned goods and bolts of cloth that represented the white world's answer to winter's cruelty. That was when he heard a sound that stopped him cold as a rifle shot. Not the usual noise of commerce, but something raw and desperate that cut through winter's howl like a blade drawn across bone. Behind the Mercantile, where refuse barrels stood like abandoned soldiers against the building's rear wall, a young woman knelt in the snow. Her dress had once been wedding white, but now the silk hung in tattered ruins around her slight frame. The delicate lace was shredded, the satin stained with mud and worse. Her bare hands, red with advanced frostbite, scrabbled through scattered garbage with the frantic efficiency of someone intimately acquainted with starvation. Wakiza moved closer, his footsteps muffled by fresh powder. The woman, she couldn't be more than 23, gathered scraps with practiced desperation. A moldy carrot here, a heel of stale bread, there anything that might keep death at bay for another day. Her breath came in short puffs, and he could see her entire body trembling beneath the inadequate protection of ruined silk. The sight struck him like a physical blow. In his culture, women held positions of honor and respect. To see one reduced to this scavenging like a wild animal in the refuse of the very people who should have protected her ignited something dangerous in his chest. "Now get away from there, you worthless wretch." The harsh voice belonged to Tom Brennan, a thick-bodied freighter who emerged from the store's back door with his arms loaded with supplies. Wakiza recognized him, one of the rougher men who worked the freight routes, known for his casual cruelty and small-minded prejudices. The woman looked up with startling blue eyes that held both defiance and fear in equal measure. "Please, Mr. Brennan, I'm only taking what would be thrown away." "Nothing here belongs to you, Sorrow Mary." The nickname dripped with malicious pleasure, clearly designed to wound. "Mr. Dietrich made that clear when he cut off your store credit. You want to eat, you know what you got to do." Color flooded her pale cheeks despite the bitter cold. "I won't be his housekeeper. Not that kind." "Then I reckon you won't eat." Brennan kicked viciously at the pile of salvaged food, sending bread and vegetables flying across the pristine snow. "Besides, decent folk don't want to see you begging like some reservation squaw. Makes them uncomfortable." The casual slur hit Wakiza like a slap, but he remained motionless in the shadows. He'd learned long ago that white men's insults revealed more about their own character than his worth. But watching this woman, this Winifred, though he didn't know her name yet, stare at the scattered food with an expression mixing heartbreak and fury, made his hand drift toward his hatchet handle. She reached for a piece of bread that had landed near Brennan's heavy boots, only to have him step deliberately closer, blocking her access with obvious satisfaction. "I said get, girl. Don't make me tell you twice." When she tried to reach around him, Brennan grabbed her wrist and yanked her upright. His thick fingers dug into flesh already mottled with old bruises, and she couldn't suppress a sharp cry of pain that seemed to echo off the alley walls. That cry shattered Wakiza's restraint like ice breaking under spring floods. "Let her go." His voice carried the flat authority of winter wind, across empty plains, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Brennan spun around his grip still tight on the woman's arm, and found himself facing someone who seemed to have materialized from the storm itself. "This ain't none of your business, Indian." Brennan's free hand dropped to the knife at his belt steel scraping against leather. "Girls got debts with white folk that don't concern you." Wakiza's own hand came to rest on his hatchet, not threatening, simply present. The weapon was a thing of deadly beauty, its steel head inscribed with flowing patterns his grandfather had taught him, its handle worn smooth by generations of warriors who had never known defeat in righteous battle. I said let her go. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, they stood frozen, Brennan with his hand on steel Wakiza, ready to draw, and the woman caught between them like a bird trapped between hunting cats. Snow continued falling around them in fat flakes that seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. Brennan was a large man, accustomed to intimidating others through size and bluster. But something in Wakiza's complete stillness, the utter absence of fear or doubt, made him hesitate. This wasn't some reservation Indian broken by government promises. This was something older, more dangerous. A tarnation. Brennan muttered, finally releasing his grip and stepping back. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway. But you remember Indian Conrad Dietrich runs this town. He don't forget folks who interfere with his property." The freighter gathered his scattered supplies and stalked away, leaving deep boot prints in the snow. Wakiza watched him disappear around the building's corner before turning his attention to the woman who had slumped against the wall. Up close, he could see the full, devastating extent of her condition. The wedding dress that served as her only protection hung in ruins, its fabric so thin he could see her ribs through the material. Her face, though still young, showed the hollow cheeks and shadowed eyes of someone who had been systematically starved. But it was her hands that made his jaw clench, frostbitten fingers bearing the telltale signs of exposure that could lead to permanent damage or worse. Without speaking, Wakiza unfastened his heavy wool cloak and draped it around her shoulders. The garment, thick and warm from his body heat, enveloped her completely. She shivered as the first real warmth she'd felt in weeks began penetrating her chilled bones, and he saw tears of relief freeze on her cheeks before they could fall. "Wait here," he said simply, and disappeared into the mercantile. Through the window, she watched him approach the counter where a nervous clerk waited. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Wakiza's measured gestures, the way he seemed to carry more authority than most white men twice his size. When he emerged moments later, he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Wakiza knelt beside her and pressed the bundle into her trembling hands. When she unwrapped it with fingers that barely functioned, the rich aroma of fresh bread rose between them, still warm from the baker's oven, representing more sustenance than she'd seen in over a week. "I can't repay you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and disuse. "No payment asked." He studied her face, noting the intelligence that sparked in those remarkable eyes, despite her desperate circumstances. Something stirred in his chest, unfamiliar and unsettling in its intensity. Eat slowly. Empty stomach will rebel if you rush. Their hands brushed as she accepted the bread, and neither moved for several heartbeats. Her fingers were ice against his palm, but steady, not the helpless flutter of someone broken by circumstances, but the controlled trembling of someone who refused to surrender. The contact sent warmth through his arm that had nothing to do with shared body heat. "What are you called?" The question surprised them both. "Winifred Casey." She attempted a smile that flickered and died like a candle in wind. "Though most folks here have other names for me these days." "I am Wakiza." He remained crouched beside her, making no move to reclaim his cloak, despite the wind cutting through his buckskin shirt like knives. "Why do you wear that dress in this weather?" The question might have sounded harsh from another man, but his tone held no judgment, only the practical concern of someone who understood survival's requirements. "It's the warmest clothing I own." She looked down at the ruined silk with bitter irony. "Was supposed to be married 3 weeks past. Groom never showed. Now I got nowhere to go and nothing left to sell." Wakiza absorbed this information without comment, but his expression hardened slightly. He'd observed enough of white society to understand what that meant for a woman without family protection. In his world, women owned property and held respected positions. Here, in this realm of paper laws and legal ownership, a woman alone was prey. "The man who bothered you mentioned someone named Dietrich." Her laugh held bitter knowledge earned through suffering. "Conrad Dietrich owns the freight company, most of the grazing land, half the mortgages in this territory, including mine now that Papa's dead." She tore off a small piece of bread and chewed carefully, following his advice. "He's been persistent in offering me employment opportunities." The euphemism needed no explanation. Wakiza had witnessed how powerful white men collected vulnerable women like livestock, useful property to be sheltered, fed, and used according to their desires. The wedding dress told him she'd tried to escape through marriage, only to find herself trapped when her intended husband vanished like smoke. Wind gusted again, sending snow spiraling around them both. Winifred pulled his cloak tighter, and Wakiza made a decision that would alter both their destinies in ways neither could imagine. "Then come," he said, rising and extending his hand toward her. "Is there a doctor in this town?" "Dr. Laurent near the church. But I cannot pay." "Did not ask about payment." His hand remained steady in the falling snow, palm up, patient as stone. "Asked about the doctor." She stared at his outstretched palm, reading something in his weathered face that made her choice for her. Slowly, she placed her smaller hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and he helped her stand with the careful attention of someone who understood that dignity mattered as much as charity. As they walked through swirling snow toward the church spire, rising above Sable Junction's modest skyline, Winifred found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. There was something about his presence, a quality of controlled strength and quiet honor, that made her feel safer than she had since her father's death. For the first time in months, she dared to hope that perhaps she wasn't entirely alone in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. Behind them, their footprints filled rapidly with fresh powder. 2 sets walking side by side, one in boots, one in moccasins, heading toward an uncertain future that neither could have imagined when morning broke over the frozen prairie. Dr. Laurent's cabin sat in the protective shadow of the town's weathered church, a modest structure carrying the mingled scents of carbolic acid and quiet determination. The physician himself was a man in his mid-40s with graying temples and hands that moved with assured precision, born of suturing more bullet wounds than he cared to remember. Mild frostbite, but treatable. he announced in French-accented English, examining Winifred's hands by lamplight. Circulation will return with proper warmth and care, but you must keep them protected. Wakiza stood near the window, his attention divided between the doctor's ministrations and the street beyond, where afternoon shadows were already lengthening. Years of survival had taught him that safety was always temporary, especially when powerful men felt their interests threatened. As Laurent worked, Wakiza found his gaze returning to Winifred's face. Even wrapped in his cloak and the doctor's additional blankets, she appeared fragile as ancient parchment. Yet there was steel in her bearing that reminded him of his grandmother, a woman who had survived the army's forced relocations and lived to raise grandchildren in defiance of those who would have crushed her spirit. She requires proper nourishment. Laurent continued wrapping her fingers in clean bandages. The body cannot heal while fighting starvation. Pride's all Conrad left me with, Winifred said quietly, but her voice wavered. The cabin's warmth and the doctor's kindness were eroding defenses she'd maintained through sheer desperation. At Conrad's name, Laurent's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over mountains. Conrad Dietrich is a plague upon this community. He grows wealthy while others starve, and Sheriff Malcolm permits it to continue. Tell me about this Dietrich, Wakiza said, filing away information with the methodical precision of a scout gathering intelligence. Laurent glanced toward the door before lowering his voice. He arrived 5 years ago with Eastern money and territorial connections, purchased the failing freight business, then systematically acquired grazing rights along the river. Now he holds mortgages on most farms and businesses throughout the valley. And when people cannot meet their obligations, he offers alternatives to payment. Very legal, very civilized, very evil. Winifred shifted in her chair, the bandages rustling like autumn leaves. Papa borrowed seed money 2 springs ago when drought killed our previous harvest. The note was supposed to clear after that year's crop, but another dry summer ruined everything. Papa worked every job he could find all winter trying to scrape together payments. Her voice grew hollow with remembered grief. The worry killed him come February. Found him in the barn one morning, just gone. Heart gave out from the strain. She touched the torn lace at her throat. Day after the funeral, Conrad appeared with legal papers claiming Papa owed 3 times the original amount, penalties, interest, administrative fees I'd never heard of. Wakiza absorbed this, recognizing tactics he'd witnessed government agents use against his own people. Create confusion, manufacture urgency, then present yourself as salvation while stripping away everything of value. The proxy marriage was Conrad's suggestion. Winifred continued. Said he knew a businessman in Denver seeking a reliable wife to manage his property while he traveled. All I had to do was sign documents, and my father's debt would disappear like morning mist. But no groom came. Never existed near as I can determine. Bitterness crept into her voice. Whole ceremony was designed to make me appear desperate and foolish. Now Conrad can point to the failed wedding whenever anyone questions why I lack family protection. A soft knock interrupted them 3 measured raps that made everyone freeze. Laurent moved to peer through curtains before relaxing visibly. "Helene," he said, unlatching the door. The woman who entered brought swirling snow and sharp intelligence. Perhaps 30, she carried herself with the upright bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Her clothing was practical but well made, and she moved with efficient grace that spoke of someone who solved problems for a living. "Miss Colette teaches our school," Laurent explained. "Helene, this is Wakiza, and you know Miss Casey." Helene's focus settled on Winifred with keen assessment. "I heard about the confrontation at the Mercantile. Conrad's men are asking questions throughout town." "What manner of questions?" Wakiza asked. "About Indian horse tracks in snow, about who might be sheltering a runaway bride." Her voice carried precise diction, but underneath lay frontier hardness. "They're suggesting rewards for useful information." The schoolteacher reached into her coat and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Winifred, you remember helping your father with merchant accounts, copying ledger entries when their penmanship became difficult?" "Of course. Papa said I had the clearest hand in the territory." "Well, I've been doing copying work myself." Helene unwrapped the bundle to reveal sheets covered in meticulous script. Financial records, debt transfers, payment schedules. Items that don't match what Conrad claims they contain. Winifred's sharp intake suggested immediate recognition. "These numbers are different from what Conrad showed me. This indicates Papa's original note was $200, not $600. And this payment record shows Papa made regular payments all winter." "Payments that somehow disappeared from Conrad's version," Helene finished. Wakiza understood the implications, even without reading ability. If Conrad was systematically falsifying records, then the corruption extended far beyond an woman's stolen inheritance. "Where are the original ledgers kept?" "Conrad's private office," Laurent said grimly. "He permits no access without direct supervision." Before Wakiza could respond, and the sound of approaching horses drifted through the window, multiple riders moving with purpose rather than casual travel. He moved to peer through curtains and counted 6 mounted figures spreading out to surround the building. "Too late for planning," he said quietly. "Time for deciding." Outside, harsh voices called orders, and the jingle of spurs announced men dismounting. Conrad Dietrich, it seemed, had grown tired of waiting for his property to return voluntarily. The front door rattled under heavy knocks. "Dr. Laurent?" Conrad's voice carried clearly through winter air, pitched to sound reasonable despite threatening circumstances. "I believe you're harboring property that belongs to me. I'd like it returned." Laurent moved from the window, his face grim. 8 men, all armed. We cannot fight our way clear." "Is there another exit?" Wakiza asked, checking the Spencer's action. "Root cellar leads to a tunnel connecting the church basement," Helene said. "Pastor Williams had it dug during the Indian troubles of '73 as a storm shelter. Snow could trap folks for days back then, and he worried about his congregation." The additional explanation made the tunnel's existence more believable. Frontier communities often built such passages for protection against both natural disasters and human threats. "Can it support all of us?" Wakiza asked. "Tight fit, but possible." "Doctor?" Conrad called again, patience, clearly wearing thin. "Send out my fiancée and the Indian who abducted her, and we can discuss compensation." Winifred's face flushed with anger. "Fiancé, that proxy ceremony wasn't even—" "Doesn't matter what it was," Wakiza interrupted. "Matters what he can make people believe it was." The door opened without invitation, admitting Conrad and 2 lieutenants. Conrad cut an imposing figure, a large man in his early 40s, whose expensive coat spoke of wealth built on others' suffering. Behind him came Rusty Joe, grizzled and scarred, and Pete Morrison, younger, but carrying himself with nervous energy that suggested violence barely held in check. "Winifred," Conrad said with false warmth, "you look unwell. Perhaps we should discuss returning you to proper care." "I'm not going anywhere with you." Conrad produced folded papers with theatrical flourish. "Proxy marriage certificate duly witnessed and recorded. You are legally speaking my responsibility." That ceremony was a sham. The law recognizes completed ceremonies, not intentions. Conrad's smile held cold satisfaction. And husbands have certain rights regarding wives' associations. Wakiza stepped forward with deliberate calm. She says the groom never appeared. Ah, yes. The mysterious Indian. Conrad's attention shifted with predatory focus. I understand you have business at my mercantile. Outstanding debt. Debt was paid last autumn. I have documentation. Conrad withdrew a leather ledger, opening it to a ribbon-marked page. My records indicate otherwise. Original debt of $60 plus accumulated penalties. Current total $215. The silence stretched taut as bowstrings. Wakiza studied the entry, noting different inks and handwriting styles suggesting recent alterations. Original agreement was $30, he said calmly. Papers can be forged. Rusty Joe interjected, hand resting on his gun. Mr. Dietrich's books are legal and official. That was when Winifred stepped forward, her voice carrying quiet steel. Your books are wrong, Conrad. I helped Papa with accounts throughout the territory, including transactions with Garrett's store. That debt was marked paid in full last September. Conrad's facade cracked slightly. Grief over your father's death has clearly affected. My memory is fine. Winifred's voice gained strength. I remember what I copied, and this ledger has been altered. Pete Morrison moved toward her, intentions clear. Enough talk. Boss wants his property back. He reached for Winifred's arm, but Wakiza was already moving. His fist caught Morrison in the solar plexus, doubling him over with explosive breath loss. The young man staggered backward, crashed into Laurent's medicine cabinet, and brought shelves down in an avalanche of glass and instruments. Rusty Joe clawed for his revolver, but Wakiza's shoulder took him in the chest before the weapon cleared leather. They went down together, rolling across the floor while Conrad shouted orders and Winifred scrambled for the exit. A gunshot cracked inside the small space, deafeningly loud. Pete Morrison had recovered enough to draw his weapon, though his aim remained unsteady. The bullet gouged a furrow across Laurent's shoulder, sending blood spattering across medical supplies. Everyone stop. Conrad roared, his own pistol trained on Winifred. Enough of this nonsense. But Winifred had positioned herself near the trap door leading to Laurent's root cellar, her hand resting on the iron ring. Their eyes met across the chaos, and understanding passed between them without words. Your choice, Indian, Conrad said with satisfaction. Surrender now or face consequences of defying lawful authority. Wakiza's response was to dive sideways as Winifred yanked open the trap door and Helene extinguished the lamps. Darkness swallowed the room an instant before gunfire erupted from multiple directions, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning as confusion replaced Conrad's careful control. In the chaos that followed, 3 figures disappeared through the floor, like ghosts melting into shadow, leaving behind only Conrad Dietrich's furious curses and the promise of pursuit that would not end until one side or the other lay defeated. The tunnel beneath Laurent's cabin stretched 30 yards through packed earth and timber supports before emerging in the church basement. Wakiza led their desperate procession through the cramped passageway, his breathing carefully controlled despite close quarters. Behind him, Winifred moved with surprising grace, while Helene brought up the rear with a small derringer clutched in steady hands. They emerged as gunfire continued rattling the doctor's cabin. Through thin walls, they could hear Conrad's men searching frantically, while their leader's voice rose in increasingly creative profanity. How long before they think to check here? Winifred whispered. Not long, Helene replied. Conrad knows about the tunnel helped finance its construction. He'll remember eventually. They gathered supplies from the pastor's stores, preserved meat hardtack, a wool blanket, then made their way to the adjoining stable where they found Helene's sturdy bay gelding, along with surprising cache of emergency provisions. That was when they heard approaching footsteps. Multiple sets of boots moving with purpose. Back doors covered by now, Helene said grimly. Conrad's not stupid. Through a gap in the stable wall, they watched armed figures moving between buildings, lanterns casting dancing shadows. At least a dozen men, all focused on preventing escape into surrounding darkness. The bridge, Winifred said suddenly. If we can reach the other side. It's a trap, Wakiza replied immediately. Open ground, no cover. But it's also the only way out that doesn't involve climbing through snowdrifts. She met his eyes with determination mixed with fear. Sometimes the dangerous choice is the only choice. He studied her face, reading courage balanced against practical understanding of their situation. Whatever else Winifred Casey might be, she was not someone who surrendered easily. We go together, he said finally. Fast and quiet. If shooting starts, we keep moving. They led the horse through the stable's rear entrance into night that offered scant protection from searching eyes. The Willow Fork Bridge loomed ahead, its wooden planks slick with ice and support posts creaking in wind that channeled down the river valley like nature's own war cry. They were halfway across when the trap sprang. Now hold it right there. Sheriff Malcolm stood at the bridge's far end, Winchester rifle trained steady despite the cold. A lean man in his 50s, whose weathered face spoke of decades walking the line between law and survival. He held his position with professional competence, while Rusty Joe and 3 riders appeared at the bridge's near end, effectively trapping them over 30 feet of black water. You're under arrest for assault and theft, Malcolm called out. Dismount slow and keep your hands visible. Wakiza felt Winifred press against his side, her body seeking warmth and reassurance. Through his shirt he could feel her heart beating rapid as a frightened bird's, but her grip on his arm remained steady. Sheriff Gaz, he called back clearly. What specific charges? Assault on Conrad Dietrich's employees, theft from the mercantile, kidnapping a territorial citizen. Kidnapping. Winifred's voice cracked with bitter laughter. I went willingly. No, that's not how the complaint reads. Rusty Joe's shouted voice thick with blood from his broken nose. Says you were threatened with violence, forced to cooperate. Wakiza's hand moved instinctively toward his hatchet, then stopped. Drawing weapons would only confirm their accusations. Instead, he made a different calculation, one depending on speed audacity and the river's dark promise below. Winifred, he said quietly, not turning around. Can you swim in this cold? Understanding flooded her voice. Yes, I can swim. Trust me. I do. The 2 words carried weight beyond simple meaning. In less than a day, they'd moved from strangers to partners, bound by shared danger and mutual dependence. Whatever happened next, they would face it as allies. Wakiza kicked the gelding forward, not toward either end of the bridge, but toward its side rail, where weathered planks offered the only barrier between them and a 30-foot drop to black water. Malcolm's rifle cracked the bullet, splintering wood inches from the horse's head. But momentum carried them through the rail in an explosion of breaking timber. The impact with the river was like being struck by a giant's fist made of ice and liquid darkness. The shock drove breath from both their lungs and sent waves of cold through their bodies that made muscles seize involuntarily. Wakiza's first desperate thought was that they'd made a terrible mistake. The water was deeper than it appeared, and the current stronger than anticipated. Fed by mountain snowmelt and constant pressure of winter runoff, the willow fork, carried them downstream with terrifying force. Chunks of ice the size of dinner plates bobbed and spun in the flow, battering against them with bruising impacts that threatened to separate them in the churning darkness. Wakiza's arm locked around Winifred's ribs, holding her head above water, while he kicked toward what looked like a sheltered eddy near the eastern bank. The cold was beyond anything he'd ever experienced, not just uncomfortable, but actively malevolent, seeking to steal warmth and life with each passing second. Winifred's body had gone rigid in his arms, her breathing coming in sharp gasps that sent puffs of vapor into the freezing air. He could feel her strength ebbing as hypothermia began its deadly work, and knew they had minutes at most before the river claimed them both. The gelding surfaced nearby, snorting and thrashing against the current with powerful strokes that spoke of an animal bred for survival in harsh country. The horse reached shore ahead of them, shaking ice from its mane as it scrambled up the muddy bank with desperate determination. By the time they dragged themselves onto a gravel bar behind a screen of leafless willows, Winifred's lips were blue, and her entire body shook with violent tremors that spoke of hypothermia's approaching embrace. Wakiza wasn't much better. His buckskin shirt hung in frozen fragments, and ice crystals formed in his hair with each labored breath. "Can you walk?" he asked through chattering teeth that clicked like castanets. Winifred tried to stand and nearly collapsed as her legs buckled. Give me a moment to find my strength." He caught her arm and steadied her, noting how she leaned into his warmth without thinking. Despite their desperate circumstances, something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of partnership that transcended mere survival necessity. She fit against his side with surprising naturalness, and he found himself thinking that if they died here, at least they wouldn't die alone. "There," she said, pointing with a shaking hand toward a weathered structure sitting alone in a snow-covered pasture. "That's Emmett's hay barn, if we can make it that far." They stumbled through knee-deep drifts that tried to trap them, with each step supporting each other when the cold made their muscles cramp and threatened to quit entirely. The journey that should have taken 10 minutes stretched into an eternity of placing one foot in front of the other, fighting against a world that seemed determined to freeze them solid where they stood. The gelding followed behind them, steam rising from its wet coat as it shook ice from its bridle with each labored step. By the time they reached the barn, all three were moving more by determination than physical ability, their breath coming in clouds that froze and fell to the ground like tiny snow. Wakiza pounded on the wooden door with numb fists until it creaked open to reveal Emmett Hartley, a man in his 50s with worried eyes and the calloused hands of someone who'd spent his life working soil that gave up its bounty reluctantly. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, get inside before you freeze solid," Emmett said, stepping aside without questions. Then he turned to peer nervously toward the bridge where lanterns bobbed like angry fireflies. "Heard the shooting. Figured it involved Conrad somehow, always does these days." The barn's interior carried blessed warmth generated by several milk cows gathered at one end in their body heat, creating a pocket of life-sustaining temperature that felt like heaven's own embrace. Emmett brought rough blankets and helped Wakiza get Winifred settled in fresh straw near the animal's comforting bulk. "Scared and half frozen, but you'll live," the farmer said after examining them with the practical eye of someone who'd treated frostbite before. "Few hours of gradual warming should see you right long as infection doesn't set in those fingers." Wakiza stripped off his ruined shirt and accepted one of the blankets, wrapping it around his shoulders as feeling began returning to his extremities in waves of painful tingling that made him grit his teeth. "How much do you know about Conrad's business practices?" "More than's comfortable for sleeping at night. Less than smart for staying healthy." Emmett glanced toward the door again, his weathered face creased with perpetual worry. "He holds my grazing note." One word from him and I lose everything I've spent 20 years building with these two hands. So you will not help us. Didn't say that. The farmer's voice carried stubborn determination of someone pushed beyond his breaking point. Said I was scared. Fear and action are different things entirely. From the barn's far corner, a small voice spoke up. "Pa, there's riders coming up the valley road. Lot of them." A boy emerged from the shadows, perhaps 10 years old, with his father's worried eyes and the quick movements of someone who'd learned early to avoid adults when trouble was brewing. Through the barn's single window, they could see torches moving in the distance, like malevolent stars against the darkness. Pressed together in hay that smelled of summer meadows and honest work, Wakiza felt Winifred's shivering gradually subside as shared body heat began its healing work. She fit against his side with naturalness that surprised them both, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as they listened to approaching hoofbeats grow steadily louder. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "For what?" "For the bridge. For not abandoning me when things became dangerous." She was quiet for a moment, her breath warm against his neck. "For believing my word against Conrad's ledger." Wakiza considered this, acutely aware of her small hand resting on his chest, and the way her hair carried the scent of river water mixed with something uniquely her own. You could have stayed clear of the whole business. Could have let Conrad's men take me and walked away clean. Clean. Her soft laugh held no humor. Nothing clean about Conrad Dietrich's version of justice. Besides, we kept each other alive back there. That creates obligations that matter. Below them, they heard the barn door creak open and Emmett's voice raised in forced casualness. "Evening, Sheriff. Hell of a night to be out riding." "Looking for dangerous fugitives." Malcolm's voice replied, carrying weary authority of someone performing unpleasant duty. "Indian and a white woman, both armed and desperate according to Conrad. They might try forcing folks to hide them." The next several minutes passed with agonizing slowness as boots moved through the barn below and voices murmured in tense conversation. Wakiza kept one hand on his hatchet and the other on Winifred's shoulder, ready to fight if discovered, but hoping desperately it wouldn't come to bloodshed. Finally, voices moved away, and the door creaked shut. They waited until hoofbeats faded into winter silence before climbing back down to where Emmett waited with his son. "They'll be back," the farmer said simply. "Conrad don't give up easy when his authority gets challenged. Man's got a reputation to maintain in this territory." "Then we need to end this before he gets another chance." Wakiza replied. "Those original ledgers, where would Conrad keep documents he wanted absolutely secure?" Emmett and his son exchanged glances before the boy spoke up in his piping voice. "There's an old office up at the Mercury mine. Saw it once when Pa had to deliver papers. Mr. Conrad keeps lots of important books there in a big iron safe." Winifred sat up straighter. "The Quicksilver mine. But that played out years ago." "Not mining did," Emmett confirmed. "But the office building's still solid, good roof, thick walls, isolated location. Conrad uses it for business he don't want conducted where folks might overhear." Wakiza absorbed this information, already calculating routes and considering obstacles. The mine would be isolated, probably guarded, definitely dangerous during winter conditions. But if the original ledgers were there, the ones proving Conrad's systematic fraud, it might represent their only chance to turn the tables. "How far?" he asked. 5 miles up canyon. Hard trail even in good weather, worse with snow and ice." Emmett shook his head grimly. "And that's assuming Conrad don't have men watching every approach." "He will," Wakiza said with certainty. but we are going anyway." As if to emphasize the danger they faced, a distant gunshot echoed across the valley, probably a signal between searchers, but a reminder that Conrad's forces remained active, still hunting. Winifred pulled the blankets tighter around herself and met Wakiza's gaze across the lantern-lit barn. "When do we leave?" The question held no fear, only resolve. Whatever else she might be, Winifred Casey was not a woman who retreated from necessary fights. And looking at her now disheveled, exhausted but unbroken by circumstances that would have crushed lesser spirits, Wakiza felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with simple partnership. The trail to the Quicksilver mine, carved through country that resembled the bones of creation itself. Red sandstone cliffs, sculpted by centuries of wind and water, into fantastic formations that cast shifting shadows in pale morning light. Wakiza and Winifred picked their way carefully along the rocky path, leading the gelding and stopping frequently to scan ridgelines for signs of watchers. 3 hours into their climb, that vigilance proved justified. Wakiza had identified smoke from at least 2 different fires positioned in the rocks above, plus occasional glints of metal that suggested rifle barrels commanding the approach routes. Conrad wasn't taking chances with security of his most sensitive documents. "There," Winifred whispered, pointing toward weathered buildings perched on a stone shelf roughly a mile ahead. "Mine office with the safe." Through Dr. Laurent's spyglass, Wakiza studied the layout with growing concern. The office was substantial, built from native stone with narrow windows and a slate roof designed to withstand mountain weather. Around it clustered the detritus of abandoned mining rusted machinery, collapsed sheds, and the dark mouth of the mine shaft itself. More troubling were the armed figures in defensive positions around the compound. 3 men with rifles visible, possibly more hidden, all positioned to cover the main trail with overlapping fields of fire. 6 men minimum, maybe 8, he said quietly. All armed, all watching the obvious approach. "So how do we get close enough to matter?" Wakiza lowered the spyglass and studied terrain with eyes trained from childhood to read landscape for advantage and opportunity. "We do not go to them. We make them come to us." The plan he outlined was dangerous, depending on precise timing, considerable luck, and Winifred's ability to handle herself under fire. But it was preferable to suicidal frontal assault against prepared positions. They separated Wakiza, circling wide to approach the compound from its blind side, while Winifred worked closer to the main trail. It took nearly an hour for him to work around to the rear, moving from cover to cover and freezing whenever voices drifted from rocks above. Right on schedule, he heard Winifred's voice calling from the main trail, "Help someone, please help me. My horse threw me and I think my ankle's broken." Through the office window, Wakiza watched 3 guards abandon their posts and head toward the sound of apparent distress. That left at least 3 others, but the odds had improved considerably. The office door stood slightly ajar. Inside filing cabinets lined walls like silent sentinels, and in the room's center sat an enormous iron safe, with its door open, revealing neat stacks of ledgers and legal documents. Wakiza had just reached for the nearest stack when a voice spoke from shadows behind him. "Wondered when you'd finally show up." He spun to find Conrad Dietrich himself standing in the doorway, flanked by Pete Morrison and a lean gunfighter with dead eyes. All 3 were armed weapons drawn, wearing expressions suggesting they'd anticipated this moment with considerable satisfaction. Conrad was exactly what Wakiza had expected, a large man whose soft features spoke of easy living, but whose pale eyes held cold calculation of someone who'd built his empire by never underestimating opponents. "You've caused considerable disruption to my business operations," Conrad said conversationally. interfered with my property, damaged my facilities, and generally made yourself a nuisance. The casual way he spoke about Winifred like livestock to be bought and sold sent hot anger coursing through Wakiza's veins, but he maintained outward composure. "What about the ledgers showing her father's debt was satisfied?" he asked. Conrad chuckled with genuine amusement. "Bookkeeping can be such a complicated discipline. Numbers have this annoying tendency to shift when circumstances require adjustment." He withdrew a thick leather book, holding it where Wakiza could see neat columns of figures. "This particular volume clearly shows your mercantile debt as considerably larger than you claimed. Fascinating how interest compounds when payments fall behind. The debt was satisfied last year." "Was it?" Conrad flipped through pages with theatrical surprise. "I see no record of such payment." That was when Wakiza heard gunfire from the direction of the main trail. Multiple weapons firing rapidly, which meant Winifred's distraction had transformed into genuine combat. Conrad heard it too, and his smile broadened with satisfaction. "Sounds like my men located your accomplice. Tragic, really. She might have survived if you'd simply minded your own affairs." The moment when Wakiza's careful self-control finally snapped arrived like summer lightning. He lunged forward not toward his weapons, but toward Conrad himself, counting on surprise and close quarters to neutralize numerical disadvantage. His shoulder took the larger man squarely in the chest, driving him backward into the open safe with a crash that scattered papers like startled birds. Pete Morrison fired, but his shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself in a filing cabinet with a sharp thunk. Wakiza grabbed Conrad's wrist and twisted, sending the man's revolver spinning across wooden floors. The professional gunman tried to acquire a clean shot, but Wakiza kept Conrad between them as they struggled for advantage. The fight spilled out into the compound, where abandoned mining equipment provided both weapons and obstacles. Conrad was soft from years of easy living, but not weak, and he fought with desperate fury of someone who'd built his life on never showing vulnerability. They rolled across rocky ground, trading punches and grappling for position. Wakiza's superior conditioning began to tell, but Conrad fought dirty knee strikes, eye gouges tactics, learned in saloons rather than honorable combat. A vicious elbow to Wakiza's ribs sent lightning through his torso and allowed Conrad to break free, scrambling toward a discarded pickaxe handle. That was when Winifred appeared at the compound's edge, running hard with blood on her sleeve and 3 of Conrad's men in pursuit. She'd lost the revolver somewhere during her flight, but she still carried Wakiza's hatchet, her face holding grim determination of someone who'd exhausted all alternatives. "The ledger," Wakiza shouted as Conrad's fingers closed around his throat. "In the safe." She dodged between legs of a rusted ore cart and dove through the office doorway, just as Pete Morrison's rifle cracked behind her. The bullet splintered the wooden frame, but she was already inside, frantically searching through scattered documents. Outside, the gunfight had become general chaos. The remaining guards converged on the compound, firing from cover, while Wakiza used Conrad as a human shield and tried desperately to reach his weapons. Smoke filled the air, along with sharp cracks of rifles and ricochets whined off metal equipment like angry insects. Through it all, Winifred worked with desperate efficiency, sorting through contracts, until she found what they needed, a book bound in green leather, with her father's name clearly visible in the index. She flipped to the relevant page and felt vindication surge through her chest like warm honey. There it was, recorded in the old storekeeper's meticulous handwriting payment, received in full for Marcus Casey's seed loan, witnessed and countersigned by Sheriff Malcolm himself. On the following page, Wakiza's account showed $30 paid, with premium furs the transaction completed and debt satisfied. But even as she discovered proof of Conrad's fraud, the battle outside was growing more desperate. Too many weapons, too many trained killers, and Wakiza caught in the middle with inadequate cover. That was when she spotted the wooden crate in the corner, old mining explosives left over from the Quicksilver's working days, probably unstable from age, but still potentially lethal. Without hesitation, she grabbed a stick of dynamite and the oil lamp from Conrad's desk. "Wakiza!" she shouted, running back into the chaos. "Move away!" He saw the explosive in one hand and lamp in the other, understood immediately what she intended, and threw himself sideways just as she ignited the fuse and hurled the dynamite toward the cluster of men near the ore processing equipment. The explosion, when it came, was smaller than expected, but loud enough to deafen everyone in the compound and send a shower of rock fragments and twisted metal flying in all directions. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by ringing ears and clatter of falling debris, Wakiza struggled to his feet and retrieved his weapons. Conrad lay stunned near the demolished ore cart, blood streaming from a scalp wound. Pete Morrison and the other gunmen were scattered and shaken, their confidence shattered along with their hearing. And Winifred stood in the office doorway, clutching the green ledger against her chest like armor. "It's finished, Conrad," Wakiza said, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. "She has the proof. The real books with the real numbers." That was when Sheriff Malcolm appeared at the compound's entrance with Dr. Laurent Helene Colette and a dozen townspeople, all armed and wearing expressions suggesting they'd finally reached the end of their patience with Conrad Dietrich's version of justice. But even as Malcolm moved to place Conrad in custody, the sheriff's weathered face carried weight of unwelcome secrets. "This doesn't end it," he said quietly, examining the green ledger with careful attention. "The situation is more complex than it appears." He opened the book to a section near the back, filled with entries in different handwriting, fresher ink that hadn't faded with age. This ledger doesn't just contain evidence of Conrad's crimes. It documents mine as well. The revelation fell over the compound like stones into still water. For 3 years, Malcolm had been accepting regular payments from Conrad to overlook irregularities in his business practices. Not occasionally, systematically. $75 to ignore Mrs. Patterson's complaint about forged mortgage papers. $100 to ensure the circuit judge never heard testimony about the Henderson land dispute. $200 to guarantee that certain federal agents never completed their scheduled negotiations with the Lakota. The final revelation hit Wakiza like a physical blow. His people had spent months wondering why promised negotiations never materialized, why government representatives simply vanished without explanation. 3 separate delegations over 2 years, Malcolm admitted. Each time Conrad paid me to create delays until the agents returned east without completing their missions. Winifred had gone pale as death. The riverfront property Conrad's been purchasing should have become treaty land, Malcolm confirmed. But without treaties in place, it remained available for private acquisition. The elegant cynicism of the scheme was breathtaking. By preventing legitimate negotiations, Conrad had created artificial scarcity that drove up land values while forcing the Lakota into increasingly desperate situations. But even as they absorbed the scope of Conrad's crimes, another realization was taking shape. If Malcolm had been accepting bribes to obstruct justice, then his confession created an impossible legal situation. "You cannot testify against Conrad without incriminating yourself," Wakiza said quietly. "And without your testimony, most evidence becomes worthless in court." The cruel irony was perfect. The very corruption that enabled Conrad's crimes would now protect him from consequences. "There has to be another way," Winifred said desperately. "My cousin Ayanna," Wakiza said suddenly. If she's been investigating the missing agents, she might have discovered evidence independent of Malcolm's testimony. Conrad, who had been listening with growing satisfaction, finally spoke up. Your cousin is in no position to help anyone. By now she's probably feeding fish at the bottom of Willow Fork. The casual cruelty struck Wakiza like a slap, but beneath anger he sensed something else. The hollow ring of a bluff designed to demoralize. Conrad was too calculating to eliminate valuable assets out of spite. She's alive, he said with quiet conviction, and you need her breathing as much as we do. Conrad's smile returned cold as January wind. Here's what will happen now. You'll return that ledger to my custody. Sheriff Malcolm will release me from these restraints. In exchange, I'll ensure your cousin finds her way safely back to her people. And if we refuse, Wakiza asked. Then Ayanna discovers what happens to people who interfere with legitimate business interests. The threat hung between them like a blade suspended by single thread. Around the compound, townspeople shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence shaken by this development. But even as the moment stretched toward impossible choice, Wakiza felt something crystallize in his chest, cold resolve that had nothing to do with ledgers or treaties or white man's law. No, he said simply. I beg your pardon. No bargains, no negotiations, no trades. Wakiza's voice carried flat finality of an avalanche beginning its descent. You will tell us where Ayanna is being held. Now. Conrad laughed, but nervousness edged the sound. You'll torture it from me, in front of witnesses I don't believe you have the stomach. Wakiza studied the man's face, reading arrogance and calculation. Their absolute certainty that his position remained unassailable. But that certainty was about to be tested in ways Conrad couldn't imagine. The ride back to Sable Junction unfolded in tense silence. Conrad secured in the back of Dr. Lawrence's medical wagon, while Malcolm's impromptu posse maintained protective formation. The Green Ledger rode in Winifred's saddlebags, its pages containing enough evidence to destroy a dozen men if they could present it without simultaneously destroying Malcolm. Conrad sat with hands cuffed behind him, but his manner suggested someone merely inconvenienced rather than defeated. Confidence comes from understanding the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent solutions, he said when Winifred observed his calm demeanor. My business associates don't appreciate threats to their investments. The first indication of trouble appeared when they crested the hill overlooking Sable Junction. Smoke was rising from multiple locations, not normal gray wisps of cooking fires, but thick black columns that spoke of deliberate destruction. Emmett's farmhouse was burning. They reached the farm to find hay storage reduced to smoldering ruins, and the main house threatened by systematically set fires. Emmett stood directing a bucket brigade of neighbors, his weathered face streaked with soot and tears of rage. 8, maybe 10 men. He gasped between throes of water. Took everything livestock winter feed seed for spring planting. 20 years of work gone in under an hour. Conrad's laughter drifted across the farmyard, harsh and satisfied. Insurance policy. A gentle reminder that actions carry consequences. But the worst revelation awaited at the schoolhouse, where they found Helene Colette sitting on front steps with her head in her hands. Around her lay scattered remains of books and papers that had been dragged from the building and burned in the street. They didn't just destroy the school, she said without looking up. They took the children. The words struck like physical blows. All of them attending evening reading class. 8 little ones aged 6 to 12. They said the children would be returned when Conrad was freed and the ledger burned to ash. Winifred had gone pale as death. Children. They took children. From the wagon, Conrad's voice carried with obscene cheerfulness. Children are so precious, aren't they? So fragile, so easily harmed if not properly supervised. It was then that Wakiza understood the true scope of their enemy. This wasn't merely about debt fraud, this was about a system of control using terror against innocence to crush anyone who dared challenge it. "Where are they being held?" he asked quietly. Conrad's smile widened with malicious pleasure. Now that would be telling, wouldn't it? But Wakiza was reading something else in the man's face, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested Conrad's position might not be as unassailable as he believed. "Ayana is not just your prisoner," Wakiza said. "She is your weakness." "I don't understand your meaning." "My cousin has been tracking federal agents for months, learning their methods and routes. If anyone knows how to locate hidden camps and safe houses, it's her. Which means she knows where you're keeping those children." He could see doubt creeping into Conrad's pale eyes now. "You're bluffing." "Perhaps. Are you prepared to wager 8 children's lives on that assumption?" For the first time since his capture, Conrad appeared genuinely worried. Finally, his voice smaller than it had been all evening, he spoke. "There's an old line shack up in Devil's Canyon, approximately 10 miles north. That's where the children are being kept." "And Ayana?" "Same location. She's with them serving as additional insurance." Wakiza absorbed this information without changing expression. "How many guards?" "4 men. They have orders to eliminate all witnesses if I fail to return by midnight." Midnight was less than 5 hours away, and Devil's Canyon was treacherous terrain even in daylight. But 8 children and his cousin depended on them, and failure was not an option Wakiza was prepared to consider. Devil's Canyon carved through the mountains like a wound that had never properly healed its walls, rising sheer and black on either side of a creek that ran silver under starlight. The old line shack perched on a narrow shelf halfway up the eastern wall, accessible only by a treacherous goat trail that switchbacked up the cliff face in hairpin turns that could kill the unwary. Wakiza and Winifred approached on foot, having left their horses tied in scrub oak nearly a mile below. The climb had consumed 2 precious hours, time they couldn't afford with midnight approaching. But no other route existed without exposing themselves to guards' rifles. Now they lay prone on a ledge above the shack, studying the layout through Dr. Laurent's telescope. What they observed made both hearts sink toward despair. The cabin was larger than expected, with thick timber walls and rifle ports cut into shutters. Lamplight leaked through gaps, and they could see armed men moving inside with confidence of people who believed themselves secure. More troubling were defensive precautions. The trail from canyon floor was blocked by felled trees, and sentries were positioned at both ends of the rocky shelf. Getting close enough to attempt rescue would require rappelling down the cliff face, and even then they'd face overwhelming numerical disadvantage. 4 guards, exactly as Conrad said, Winifred whispered. But that cabin's constructed like a fortress. Wakiza had spotted the same defensive features, plus several others, that made their situation even more desperate. Wood piles stacked against the rear wall. If they ignite it, anyone inside becomes trapped. A sound from below made them freeze voices, carrying clearly in thin mountain air. "Told you before we wait for signal from town. Boss said midnight, not 1 second earlier. And if no signal comes, what then?" "Then we follow the other orders he gave us. All of them just like he said." Understanding passed between Wakiza and Winifred without words. There would be no negotiation, no last-minute reprieve. Conrad's men had their instructions and were prepared to follow them regardless of consequences. "How do we get down there?" Winifred asked quietly. Wakiza studied the cliff face, noting cracks and ledges that might offer handholds in darkness. You remain here. Too dangerous. No. Her voice carried quiet steel. Those children are down there because of me. We're partners in this. Whatever happens, we face it together. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition transcending shared danger. They had chosen to trust each other with things that mattered more than mere survival. There's rope in my saddlebags, he said finally. Enough to get us both down safely if we're extremely careful. The descent consumed another precious hour with Wakiza, testing each handhold and Winifred following with careful precision. By the time they reached the ledge where the cabin sat, the moon had moved noticeably across the star-filled sky. From their new position, they could hear voices inside, not just guards, but higher, younger voices that made Winifred's chest tight with protective fury. The children were alive and conscious, but their captors were growing more nervous as midnight approached without word from Conrad. A movement on the main trail. One guard called from his position near the blocked entrance. Riders coming up from below. Wakiza felt his blood turn to ice water. But as hoofbeats grew closer, he recognized something familiar in the rhythm. Ayana, he breathed. His cousin appeared at the shelf's edge like a ghost, materializing from shadow, leading 6 Lakota warriors on horses that moved with silent grace of hunting wolves. She had somehow escaped captivity, found allies, and tracked the children to their prison. But if Ayana's arrival represented salvation, the guards' reaction was pure panic. Shouts erupted from inside the cabin, and they worked the levers on their Winchesters with metallic clicks that echoed off canyon walls. Light the kindling, someone screamed from inside. Light it now before they reach us. Orange flame bloomed against the cabin's rear wall as someone hurled a torch into carefully stacked wood. The dry timber caught immediately, sending smoke and sparks spiraling upward. In minutes, the entire back wall would be engulfed, trapping anyone inside in a furnace of superheated air. That was when Wakiza made the most difficult decision of his life. Instead of waiting for better opportunity, he simply stood up and walked directly toward the cabin's front door. Wakiza, no. Winifred hissed desperately, but he was already moving with calm purpose of someone who had accepted necessity of extreme action. The first guard spotted him and raised his rifle, hesitating for a crucial second, probably trying to understand why a lone man would walk openly toward certain death. That hesitation cost him everything, as Wakiza's hatchet took him squarely in the chest before he could fire. The second guard reacted more quickly, getting off a rifle shot that burned across Wakiza's shoulder and spun him halfway around with its impact. Pain exploded through his arm, hot and immediate, but Winifred was already moving behind him, the heavy revolver bucking in her hands as she put 2 bullets center mass into the man's torso. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned supreme. The remaining guards struggled to maintain control over 8 terrified children, while smoke poured in through the burning rear wall and gunfire cracked outside. When Wakiza kicked in the front door with explosive violence, they turned their weapons on him without hesitation. The firefight that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity compressed into heartbeats. Wakiza dove left as rifle fire splintered the doorframe into deadly fragments rolled behind an overturned table, and came up shooting with the Spencer carbine. His first shot took one guard in the shoulder, spinning the man around, but failing to drop him. Blood sprayed across the cabin walls as the wounded man staggered and tried to bring his weapon back into line. Wakiza's second shot found its mark. The final guard had grabbed one of the children, a small girl with terror-bright eyes, and was using her as human shield while backing toward the burning rear wall, where smoke grew thicker with each passing moment. "Drop your weapon," the man screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Drop it, or the girl dies right here." Wakiza lowered the Spencer, but didn't release it. his gaze never leaving the guard's face. Behind the man, flames licked hungrily at log walls, and smoke grew denser with every breath. "Release her," Wakiza said with deadly calm. "Buildings burning. We all die if we don't evacuate immediately." Should have considered that before charging in here. The guard's gun barrel pressed against the child's temple, making her whimper with terror. "Now everybody burns together." That was when Winifred appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with soot and her eyes blazing with protective fury that transcended rational thought. She didn't speak, didn't threaten or negotiate. She simply raised her revolver and put a bullet through the guard's skull from 15 feet away. The man dropped like a felled tree, his weapon clattering across wooden floors as the child scrambled away with panicked sobs. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by crackling flames and crying of frightened children, Wakiza felt something fundamental shift in how he perceived the woman beside him. The moment stretched like eternity as Winifred stood frozen, the smoking revolver still extended in her grip, staring at what she had done. Her hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the magnitude of taking a human life to protect innocent children. The weight of that choice, the terrible necessity of it, crashed over her like a physical wave. "Everyone out!" she shouted, shaking herself back to action and already moving to gather the children toward the door. "Now, before the roof comes down." They herded 8 young souls outside, just as the cabin's rear wall collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Ayanna and her warriors had secured the rocky shelf, their rifles trained on the trail below in case additional enemies appeared. "My cousin," Ayanna said as Wakiza emerged with a child in his arms. She was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. I was beginning to think I'd have to rescue myself. "How did you escape?" She smiled grimly, displaying a bent hairpin. They underestimated what a determined woman can accomplish with simple tools. Also, they failed to account for how many friends I've cultivated in the territorial militia. She gestured toward her companions, and Wakiza realized not all were Lakota warriors. 3 wore blue uniforms of federal cavalry, their faces unmarked by paint, but bearing unmistakably military bearing, despite their participation in what amounted to an Indian war party. "Captain Morrison, 3rd Cavalry," one said, stepping forward. "We've been investigating those missing federal agents your cousin mentioned. Turns out Conrad Dietrich has been interfering with official government business for several years." The final pieces were falling into place. Ayanna hadn't simply escaped. She'd made contact with federal authorities who had their own compelling reasons for wanting Conrad brought to justice. But even as victory settled over the canyon, Wakiza found himself thinking not about Conrad or corruption, but about the woman who stood methodically checking each child for injuries. She had risked everything to help people she barely knew, had faced armed killers without flinching, and had somehow maintained her essential humanity through circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. The first gray light of dawn was breaking over Sable Junction when their convoy of rescued children finally reached town. The 8 young ones rode double with Ayanna's warriors, their faces still pale from ordeal, but eyes beginning to brighten as familiar landmarks came into view. Dr. Laurent waited at his improvised clinic in the church basement, having donated what medical supplies he could gather. Frightened and cold, but no serious injuries. He reported to anxious parents who had gathered despite the early hour. They're remarkably resilient, these little ones. Wakiza watched the emotional reunions from respectful distance, feeling complex mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The immediate crisis had been resolved, children were safe. Conrad's empire was crumbling as federal marshals rounded up his associates. But victory carried hollow quality when measured against all the destruction that had been necessary to achieve it. Having second thoughts, Winifred asked, appearing with 2 cups of coffee. Some, he admitted, considering all the damage that might have been prevented if people had found courage to oppose Conrad years earlier. Perhaps. Or perhaps more innocent people would have died if we'd attempted to fight him before we possessed evidence necessary to prove our accusations. She sipped thoughtfully. Evil men count on good people feeling guilty about harm that comes from stopping them. Don't grant him that final victory. It was wise counsel delivered with hard-earned understanding that came from surviving genuine trauma. Wakiza found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting how the past few days had transformed her from desperate victim into someone radiating quiet confidence born of tested strength. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Rebuild, I suppose. The farm still exists, even if the debt against it was fraudulent. Someone needs to work that land." She was quiet for a moment. "What about you?" "Ayana says the army wants me to serve as cultural liaison during treaty negotiations. Help ensure both sides understand what they're agreeing to accept." He looked into his coffee. "Important work. Could help my people avoid mistakes other tribes have made. But it would require spending most of the year traveling between reservation lands and territorial capitals. Not much opportunity for..." He gestured vaguely. "For what specifically?" Before he could respond, Captain Morrison approached with official documents sealed in red wax. Federal commendations for civilian assistance in a matter of national importance. They establish your credibility as witnesses should anyone question your motivations. After Morrison departed Wakiza and Winifred found themselves alone again in growing dawn light. Around them, the town was beginning to stir as people emerged to assess damage and begin rebuilding. "Federal commendation," Winifred said, examining the document. "Papa would have been so proud." "He would have been proud of your actions regardless of any official paper. You saved those children's lives through courage and skill." "We saved them. Together. The same way we accomplished everything else that mattered." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. They had endured more together in 3 days than most people experienced in lifetimes, but shared danger wasn't necessarily the same as shared affection. "Miss Winifred," a small voice interrupted. They turned to see one of the rescued children standing nearby with her parents. "Yes, sweetheart. Mama says I should thank you properly for protecting me from those bad men. So thank you for keeping me safe." The simple words struck with more force than any federal commendation. Winifred knelt to the child's level and gently touched her cheek. "You were extraordinarily brave, Sarah. Much braver than I felt. But you had the gun. I couldn't have shot that bad man myself. I'm not tall enough yet." After the family moved away with expressions of gratitude, Winifred stood quietly for a long moment, processing emotions she was still learning to understand. "I killed a man last night," she said finally. "You saved a child's life." Both statements are true simultaneously. She looked at him with eyes holding new depth. "I keep expecting to feel different somehow. Guilty, perhaps, or traumatized. But all I feel is profound relief that little girl gets to return home. That's what separates you from Conrad. You can take a life to protect innocence, but you don't derive pleasure from it. You do what circumstances require, then you bear the full weight of those actions." Spring arrived early in the Willow Fork Valley that year, melting winter's accumulated snow and coaxing green shoots through dark earth with unprecedented eagerness. The rebuilding of Sable Junction had progressed steadily through cold months, transforming destruction into opportunity. Emmett's new barn stood twice the size of its predecessor. Dr. Laurent's clinic boasted modern equipment, and the schoolhouse bore a bronze plaque commemorating the rescued children. Wakiza stood at the edge of Winifred's newly planted fields, watching her guide a sturdy plow horse through rich soil in straight, precise furrows. The sight never failed to amaze him. This woman who had once scavenged for scraps now commanded acres of productive farmland with confident skill. "Admiring your investment," she called out. "Admiring the farmer," he replied, earning one of her rare, genuine smiles. The legal partnership they'd established had proven both practical and profitable. Wakiza's knowledge of land management combined with Winifred's understanding of crops had created one of the most efficient farming operations in the territory. The federal commendations had opened doors with officials and secured fair treatment in business dealings. But more significant than business success, their partnership had provided, both with something neither had expected, a sense of belonging that transcended mere survival. "Treaty's been signed and ratified," Wakiza announced when she paused to rest the horse. "Ayana brought official word this morning. Final terms were approved yesterday in Denver." "Favorable terms." "Better than expected, though not as generous as some hoped. The Lakota retain hunting and fishing rights along portions of the Willow Fork watershed, plus modest monetary compensation for lands Conrad illegally purchased. The federal government pays current market value, which provides some capital for those who choose farming over traditional ways." "And those who prefer the old ways?" "Can keep access to designated traditional territories with federal protection against further encroachment." It's a compromise, but one that recognizes both sides' legitimate interests. It represented a significant victory made possible partly by evidence they'd helped gather about Conrad's systematic interference. Justice moved slowly through official channels, but it did move when properly motivated, and the results, while imperfect, were better than many had feared. Dr. Laurent appeared on horseback, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. "Conrad's been sentenced," he announced without preliminary conversation. 20 years in the territorial penitentiary under federal contract plus full restitution to everyone he defrauded. His attorneys managed to avoid capital punishment in exchange for complete testimony against other corrupt officials. 20 years, Winifred mused. He'll be an elderly man when released. If he survives incarceration. Territorial prisons aren't renowned for hospitality toward corrupt officials, and Conrad made numerous enemies during his years of systematic intimidation. After Laurent departed, they walked back toward the farmhouse that had become their shared home. Over winter months, a simple but solid structure with a wide porch that captured morning sunlight and a kitchen garden providing fresh vegetables. They had married in a quiet ceremony the previous autumn, with Captain Morrison officiating and most of the town attending. Not the fraudulent proxy marriage Conrad had arranged, but genuine partnership between two people who had chosen each other freely after testing their compatibility under extreme circumstances. Despite the legitimacy of their union and the community's general acceptance, Wakiza was acutely aware of the occasional skeptical glances and whispered comments that followed them through town. Some of the older residents still harbored deep prejudices about marriages between whites and Indians, viewing such unions as unnatural or problematic. But these voices grew quieter with each passing month as their partnership proved both stable and beneficial to the community. "Copper for your thoughts," Winifred said as they settled on porch steps to watch sunset paint western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Thinking about time and change. How rapidly things transform when you're not paying careful attention." "Mostly positive changes, thankfully." "Mostly, yes." He took her hand, noting how calluses from farm work had replaced frostbite scars from that terrible winter when they'd first encountered each other. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I hadn't come to town that particular day? Every single day, but not with regret. Whatever circumstances brought you to Sable Junction at precisely the right moment, I remain grateful beyond words. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing in darkening sky. Around their homestead, familiar sounds of evening settled over the valley nightbirds, calling to mates, cattle lowing in distant pastures, whisper of wind through new grass, promising abundant growth. "There's something important I haven't told you," Winifred said suddenly. "About Conrad's final sentencing and evidence they discovered." Wakiza waited patiently, sensing whatever she needed to share carried significant implications. When federal agents cleared out his office completely, they found a safe deposit box containing documents he'd been preserving as insurance against business partners. One of those documents was the original proxy marriage certificate, the one supposedly making me his legal property. And it was never properly filed with territorial authorities, never made legally binding. The entire ceremony was just elaborate theater, a method to humiliate me publicly and make me feel trapped without alternatives. Her voice carried mixture of residual anger and profound relief. I was never actually married to anyone before our real ceremony. The whole thing was simply another layer of Conrad's deception. The revelation shouldn't have mattered significantly. They were legally married now, their partnership established through genuine choice rather than legal coercion. But somehow, it felt important anyway, like the final piece of Conrad's web of lies being swept away completely. "Does this change anything fundamental?" Wakiza asked. "No, but it makes our actual wedding feel even more meaningful. The choice we made to be together, the vows we spoke because we meant them, rather than because circumstances forced them upon us." She squeezed his hand gently. "It makes everything feel more honest and authentic somehow." A shooting star streaked across the sky above them, brilliant and brief against darkness. Winifred made a silent wish upon it, though she didn't share the specific content. Wakiza suspected it had something to do with the letter from Dr. Laurent that had arrived the previous week, confirming what they'd both hoped but hadn't dared assume. Come winter, their household would expand from 2 people to 3. "Happy?" he asked, though the answer was clearly visible in her face. "Completely. Nervous about the future, certainly, but deeply happy." They remained together until the moon rose full and bright over the eastern ridge, talking quietly about their plans for the farm and the approaching harvest and the future they were constructing together, one careful day at a time. It wasn't the passionate romance of popular novels, but something more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and hard-won knowledge that they could depend on each other when everything else collapsed. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Winifred paused at the door and looked back toward town, where lights glowed warmly in windows. "You know what strikes me as most remarkable about this entire experience," she said thoughtfully. "What's that?" If Conrad hadn't been so completely greedy, so absolutely determined to control everything around him, none of our positive outcomes would have occurred. His systematic corruption brought us together, provided compelling reasons to fight, and ultimately created the life we share now. Wakiza considered this irony that evil, in overreaching its natural boundaries, had inadvertently created conditions for its own defeat and their mutual salvation. "Perhaps that represents genuine justice," he said finally. "Not merely punishment for wrongdoing, but transformation of harm into something demonstrably better." Perhaps. Or perhaps we simply experienced extraordinary good fortune. Perhaps both explanations contain truth. Inside their home, they banked the fire and prepared for sleep in comfortable routines of a partnership that had weathered genuine hardship and emerged stronger than either had thought possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, endless work of farming responsibilities of citizenship in a growing community, uncertainties of raising a family on the frontier where survival often depended on character rather than circumstances. But they would face those challenges as they had faced everything else together, as genuine partners committed to justice and mutual support. In a territory where survival frequently depended on luck rather than planning, that felt like the greatest victory possible. Outside their window, the Willow Fork River ran silver under moonlight, carrying seasonal snow melt toward distant plains where other people struggled with their own versions of injustice and corruption, their own desperate needs for courage and partnership. Some would discover what they needed. Others would not. But the example established in Sable Junction that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil and ultimately prevail would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating changes that none of them could predict or measure. Justice was exactly like that, Wakiza reflected as sleep claimed him. It began with individual choices made under pressure, grew through shared sacrifice and mutual support, and ultimately transformed entire communities in ways that could never be planned, but only lived through with integrity intact. And sometimes, if people demonstrated sufficient courage and enjoyed reasonable fortune, it even created lasting love, where none had existed before, growing strong in soil fertilized by shared trials and watered with mutual respect that would endure long after immediate dangers were forgotten.